Hello viewers, and a warm welcome to the show this evening. I'm your host Chef Andy, and as you can see, I'm joined by a very beautiful guest on the show today. I will of course allow her to say one or two words before I proceed to introduce the show. Eunice?
Hi viewers, my name is Eunice Wairimu. I'm working and studying. I'm a data analyst by profession.
Thank you very much, Eunice. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Now, of course, before we proceed, very important that I introduce the ingredients that we'll be working with, just to give you an idea of what to expect for the show. Now, on this particular episode, I'm going to be focusing on the beautiful uses of pork. I'm going to be working with some pork tenderloin, and I'm going to be showing you how to marinate that very, very simply and turn them into some very beautiful and succulent skewers. For this recipe, you will, of course, require about 5 or 6 cloves of garlic, some mint leaves or sprigs of some mint leaves, a bit of some fresh thyme, about 1 tablespoon of some soy sauce, 1 teaspoon of some apple cider vinegar or some red wine vinegar. You'll also require about 1 teaspoon of some olive oil, a few sprigs of some fresh rosemary, about 100 to 150 grams of some pork tenderloin. You'll also require 1 whole orange, a few leaves of some mixed lettuce, about 5 or 6 pieces of some skewers, a glass of orange juice, and about half a cup of some canned sweet corn. And of course, last but not least, some peppercorns to crush and season with, some salt to season with as well, and of course some oil to cook with. But before we begin, we'll of course give you this chance to sit back, relax and unwind, and we'll catch you after a short break. Pork fillet is also a very, very good cut to be able to work with. Of course, a little bit on the expensive end, but it will of course also give you a very, very beautiful skewer for your process. So begin your process by cleaning out your pork, by cleaning out any excess fat that you can be able to see with your naked eye. Something very, very important to mention: if you don't take out these parts of the fat that we're removing now, it actually makes your meat very chewy. Hello viewers, and welcome back yet again. Now for some of you who are just tuning in, you've just pretty missed out on the introduction of the dish for today, which is some very, very simple pork tenderloin skewers. We're of course going to be marinating our pork in some very, very beautiful herbs, which I will of course take you through in a very, very little bit. And of course, just to bring you back to scratch, we also have Eunice on the show today, a very, very important guest that managed to make some time to join us today. And she's of course also going to be taking some time and learning some very, very beautiful ways of coming up with some very simple and homemade pork skewers. Now we're going to start off the process very simple, Eunice. Okay. And we'll start by making the marination for our pork. Now being that we're going to be marinating it in some orange, we're going to be using some orange juice. Okay. So I'll start by adding some orange juice to a bowl, about 1 cup. We're also going to be incorporating a few of our fresh herbs. So I'm going to be adding to that a few sprigs of rosemary. So just begin by taking off the leaves completely, and you can discard the stalk, and very simply proceed to chop your rosemary very finely. Right, once your rosemary is chopped, proceed to add that into your bowl with the orange juice. Now very important to also remember some salt. Okay. Also going to add some black peppercorns. And I'm also going to be adding to that some fresh garlic. So take about 3 cloves of garlic and proceed to chop that very, very coarsely. We're also going to add that to a bowl. And of course, last but not least, some few sprigs of some fresh thyme. So for this, we're going to just take out the very, very tiny leaves, and I'll allow you to finish that for us.
Okay.
And while Eunice does so, I'm also going to be working on a very, very simple marination for our simple salad that's going to be accompanying our dish for today. So to that, I'll begin by adding my red wine vinegar into a bowl. Add a bit of olive oil to that as well. We're also going to be seasoning that. Let me grab that. We're also going to be seasoning that with a bit of some salt.
So I'm supposed to mix it?
Yeah, you can start whisking that.
Okay.
Add a bit of some black peppercorns. And we're pretty much going to proceed to whisk this a little later in the process once we're ready to assemble our salad. So I'm going to allow this to sit undisturbed at the back, giving me just enough time to begin to cut up the pork. So as I mentioned, we're going to be working with some pork tenderloin for this. You can of course be able to find any beautiful cut of some boneless pork that will go quite well with this. So pork fillet is also a very, very good cut to be able to work with. Of course, a little bit on the expensive end, but it will of course also give you a very, very beautiful skewer for your process. So begin your process by cleaning out your pork by cleaning out any excess fat that you can be able to see with your naked eye. And of course, this process is also called removing the sinew. So sinew is basically the gray part of the meat. Now this we normally take out because of the fact that it becomes very, very chewy and it makes the meat very hard to digest. So very important that we begin by removing that first.
Wow, that's new.
Is this new?
Yeah, I didn't know about that part.
Now, something that most people also tend to forget at times is, you know, normally when you go to the butcher, normally you have different cuts of meat from different parts of the animal.
Yeah.
So some pieces of meat that you get are also different for some different techniques. So if you're making something that maybe does not have any bones, you'll probably get something similar to this, which is of course tenderloin or pork fillet.
Okay.
And this is also very good, for instance, if you're going to be maybe making some fried pork. Maybe you're just making some pork as a stew, or maybe just frying it just to eat on its own. It's also a very, very good cut. But something very, very important to mention, if you don't take out these parts of the fat that we're removing now,
okay,
it actually makes your meat very chewy. So what happens is when you bite onto your skewer, you'll keep chewing and you can't be able to break it down. So very important that you take this out on your own. And of course, for some of you who may of course you may not be able to know how to do so, you can of course also ask your butcher to take the sinew or the trimmings off for you completely. And this will of course also save you the cost of paying for all this fat that you're going to throw away at home. So one particular tip I can share with you, if you can be able to ask your butcher to remove the fat for you while you're buying the meat, you'll of course be able to buy meat that doesn't have fat. So always make sure to try and make sure the fat is removed at the butcher, so you don't actually pay for it, then remove it and throw it away when you get to your house. Yeah. Right, so turn over your piece of pork and proceed to clean out very, very gently. Of course, also making sure not to trim any chunks of meat from your pork fillet or your pork tenderloin, because this will of course mean that you are going to be wasting part of your meat. And once that is done, we're pretty much going to continue to cube this into some 1-inch cubes. Of course, making sure that the sizes are almost the same all the time, so that they actually take the same amount of time to cook.
Okay.
And as I continue to work towards the last and final bit of this dish, I will of course also be mentioning that you can of course be able to use very, very many different alternative of marination. So for this particular one, we're going to be focusing on just the orange and the herbal part of the marination. So once this is cut up, we're going to add that into our marination. I'm just going to get rid of the fat, and I'll just switch that and give you a spoon so you can continue to mix that through. And of course, while we do so, this pork will of course take a little bit of time to marinate. So anywhere between 1 hour to 2 hours is actually very, very good if you're going to be making your pork to order. But remember, if you're going to be making this in advance, you can also marinate this the night before or a day before. Allow it to sit in your refrigerator right up until the time you're ready to cook. So just to bring you back to scratch with what you're doing today, very, very simple technique of making a marination, but of course the last and final addition to a marination before we finish off, a bit of some light soy sauce. Now this is of course going to give it a beautiful flavor, and it's also going to give it a nice beautiful kick of iodine to it. And of course this will take us to the next process of basically assembling our skewers, and we'll of course begin to fry them on a pan or on a griddle pan. But before we get there, I will of course take a very, very quick break, but do not touch that dial. When we do come back, I will take you through the very simple process of assembling your skewers and grilling them. And I'm also going to show you the last and final step of making a very, very simple citrus salad, which will of course incorporate a bit of some orange, a bit of some sweet corn, and lastly, a bit of some fresh lettuce. So see you in a little while. We're going to start off the process by assembling our skewers. And we're going to start off very simply by taking out the meat from the marination. So very simply, we'll begin by working our pieces of pork, of course pricking almost towards one end and then folding that over, and proceed to do that, of course adding about 3 pieces of your pork tenderloin or your pork fillet onto each skewer. Welcome back, viewers. If you're just getting time to tune into the show this evening, we've pretty much begun by introducing the show. We also introduced the guest of today, whose name is Eunice. We've also worked on some pork which is already marinating, but I do have one that we actually had done a little earlier. So we're going to start off the process by assembling our skewers. And we're going to start off very simply by taking out the meat from the marination. I will of course mention the liquid is of course also very useful at this. After this process, I will of course take you through a very simple technique of reducing this into a glaze, which you can actually be able to use on your pork. But we will begin the process very simply by taking out the pork from the bowl. And we're basically going to allow those to sit on a plate right up until we're ready to assemble our skewers. Very important to also mention, I'm also going to be using a griddle for this process. So you can of course be able to use a frying pan, or you can alternatively also place your skewers in a bowl, pretty much anything easy to use or bake with, such as this. And you can also be able to bake those in the oven. And this will of course save you a bit of time in watching them and turning them on a pan. They will of course also color and cook a little more evenly. But for this particular episode, I'm going to be focusing on the pan technique or the frying technique. So Eunice, I'll begin by asking you to take out the cubes from the marinade. I'm also going to mention, due to the fact that you're using skewers, very important to make sure to rinse them in a bit of water. And what this will do is actually, it will of course aid in making sure that your skewers will not shrink as soon as they go onto the pan. And it's also going to be a very, very good handy tip, especially if you're going to be using or cooking this on a barbecue. You will of course on many occasions realize that when you put your skewers on a barbecue, the ends will of course begin to darken and curl up, and they'll actually maybe shrink in size. So one particular way of making sure that that doesn't happen is by always dipping them in a bit of water just before you proceed to assemble your skewers. And that will of course aid in making sure that your bamboo skewer will actually not catch fire, and it will actually be able to maintain its appearance and shape right up until the final part of your cooking process. Right, so as Eunice continues to take out the pork from the marination, I will of course bring you back to the bowl that we had a little earlier, which we of course had a bit of salt and pepper, a bit of some red wine vinegar, and a bit of some olive oil. So proceed by whipping that up into a dressing, which we're of course going to be using to dress our salad with. So continue to whip that with a whisk right up until the mixture just almost becomes a little cloudy in appearance. And this will of course mean that the oil and your vinegar is completely combined. And once you have it in a very, very beautiful, almost consistent brownish consistency, proceed to actually tip all that over into a bowl, and of course set your dressing aside to use a little later. But very importantly, keep your bowl with you. And remember, this is also very, very handy in dressing your salad. So in the same bowl, proceed to add your lettuce leaves. To that, we're also going to be adding a few of our sprigs of mint. So I'm going to proceed to pull out some of the leaves of our fresh mint from the stalks and proceed to add that in the bowl with the lettuce. We're also going to add to that our sweet corn. And we're pretty much now going to proceed to peel our orange and add the segments to our salad. Also to mention, Eunice has also poured the mixture into a pan right at the very end. Now this is a very, very good way of making sure that you actually don't lose out on your marination. It's also a very, very good way of making a very, very simple sauce to accompany your meat. So we're going to, we can move that a little closer. And what we're going to do is we're going to allow that to continue to cook at a very, very low temperature right up until the mixture is almost completely reduced or reduced beyond half. Right, so I will ask you to put on some gloves, Eunice, as I take you through the process of assembling these. Now, very, very simple technique, as I mentioned, of making skewers. You can, of course, be able to get longer skewers, maybe something a little longer than this. And you can actually be able to make your chunks a little bit bigger by, of course, cutting your meat in a very, very different consistency if you are, of course, looking at a very, very different result. But remember, the skewers do come in very, very different sizes. You can, of course, also be able to use toothpicks, which will, of course, make you bite-sized ones. These particular ones are very, very good for parties or for small gatherings. So if you're also looking at a good way of serving meat, maybe on a stick, you can be able to do it with these. And these are very, very easy to find locally. Just walk up to any particular supermarkets and ask for some bamboo or some wooden skewers. You'll actually be able to find this in abundance. And as I mentioned, they're also a very, very good technique of serving finger food at home. So if you're also having a party, maybe you're thinking of doing some nyama choma, you can also be able to do it on skewers, and it also makes it easier to portion out your food for your guests. Right, so I'm going to show you the first one and I'll allow you to continue with the rest. So very simply, we'll begin by working our pieces of pork, of course pricking almost towards one end and then folding that over, and proceed to do that, of course adding about 3 pieces of your pork tenderloin or your pork fillet onto each skewer, and that should actually be the size we're looking for.
Okay.
Right, so as Eunice continues to do so, and I'm pretty much, you need skewers?
Yeah.
Right. So as you continue to do so, I'll also take you through a very, very simple technique of segmenting an orange. So this is also a very good way of serving oranges in a salad. So very, very simply begin by slicing off the end pieces of your orange and set those aside. And using a sharp knife, proceed to peel your orange very, very simply, making sure, of course, to not leave any bit of the whitish rind part of the orange. Proceed to slice that through. And you can proceed to discard the peel. And very, very simply, using your sharp knife once more, proceed to slice your segments out. Of course, cutting right through the membrane That should make it so much easier for you to get your segments out in a very orderly fashion. And as you work towards the last and final piece of your orange segment, that should actually give you just enough time to reduce your liquid, or rather to reduce your marination on your pan. And you can of course be able to do such techniques or do such processes of your cooking by doing them way in advance. You can of course cut your segments way before the time that you will of course be working on your salad. But I always recommend, if you're going to be making salad, rather to proceed to cut all your vegetables or slice your vegetables closest to the time that you will of course be serving your or assembling your salad. And this will of course also make sure that you actually don't also lose out on all the juices from your vegetables and your ingredients from seeping to the bottom of your bowl. Right, so once you have all your segments completely detached from your membrane, you can proceed to discard the rest of your ingredients. Very, very importantly, always keep your chopping board nice and dry by making sure to wipe out any particular juices that are left over on your board. And you can now proceed to add your orange segments to your salad. Right, so very, very simply, using a spoon, proceed to toss your ingredients for your salad in your bowl. Eunice, we're good to go?
Yeah, we're good.
Perfect. So as I mentioned, very, very simple way of combining your salad. So once that is mixed through, all we need to do is allow that to sit on the side right up until when we're ready to plate. And you can of course take this off completely, always making sure to keep your hands nice and steady as you do so. And now all we're left to do now is we can proceed to turn that off completely. So you can turn that off completely. And this will of course take us to the next step of our process, which is to add our skewers onto the pan. So you're going to add one piece at a time. And while Eunice does so, I will of course remind you as well that we of course are going to be serving our skewers with a very, very simple salad. Very important that I mention, you can of course be able to alternate this and use any particular starch of your choice. You can also be able to make any particular salad that you may of course prefer to this. And of course also very important to mention, always have just enough dressing on the side. This is of course to also make sure that you also have a bit of dressing to carry through your salad to the very end. You can also of course rest your salad in your refrigerator if you're of course going to be serving it a little later. But since we're going to be serving this directly onto the plate, I'm going to proceed to move our salad onto our plate. Right, so very simply begin your process by moving the biggest chunks first. So I'm going to begin with the lettuce leaves, placing them one at a time on our plate. Right, so simple as that. So we're just pretty much going to begin by adding our salad, lettuce first. Then of course proceed to add your bits of orange and your sweet corn. And very importantly, always also make sure to mix it through before you continue to serve.
Yep.
That way you also have a bit of the dressing coating each and every bit of your salad. Right, so after adding a few segments of orange, you can proceed to top that with a bit of lettuce on the top. And just very simply proceed to add your segments of your orange on the side. And of course spoon the rest of your corn right over the top. Nice and colorful, yeah?
Yeah.
You can also add some tomatoes, especially if you're looking at adding a bit of color. And you can also add a bit of some pieces of tomatoes on the side. And that's also going to break the monotony of the yellow. And of course, always recommend to have a bit of dressing on the side. This is of course to be able to add on to your dressing if it is of course a bit dry. Right, and while we do so, very, very simply, I'll bring you back to the reduction that we did a little earlier. Now this, on many occasions, most of us always tend to not have a place to use our marination, or sometimes you marinate your meat and maybe you're not feeling like you want to throw it away. And because of the fact that you can't also keep the marination because you had raw meat inside it, you have to finish it on the same day. The best way to actually be able to use such waste is pretty much you can reduce your marination on a pan, and this will basically give you a very, very beautiful glaze. And what this will do is we're going to be using it to brush on the meat. So I'll begin the process by taking out the pieces of garlic that we have in our reduced marination mixture, and you can proceed to throw that away. And of course, with a simple brush, proceed to mix that through in your pan. Of course, making sure that the glaze is completely nice and thickened. Very, very simply, you can proceed by checking the consistency by lifting that very simply with a brush. And it should actually be able to clinch onto the brush very, very simply. And this will, of course, be able to give you the insight that it's actually thick enough, and you can also be able to brush it on each piece. Right, so we're going to begin to turn them over as we continue. And now another thing to also bring you up to notch with, remember skewers will, of course, cook a little faster than bigger chunks of meat. So you should actually be looking at about 6 to 8 minutes on each side. Of course, very, very important to continue to turn the meat as you continue to cook, just to make sure that you get a nice, beautiful, even coloring on each side. And very importantly, of course, if you're going to be making bigger chunks, very important to also mention, you may, of course, also need the use of an oven just to make sure that the meat cooks completely through. But as I can see, Eunice, you've got a nice, beautiful color on each of your pieces. Perfect. Now what you're going to do next is we're going to brush a bit of the reduced marination on each of our pieces. And what this is going to do is it's also going to give it a bit of color. It's also going to give it a bit of flavor. And will also make sure that the meat is also not very dry on the top.
Okay.
So very gently on each piece here, just the same way. And something also to mention also for the skewers, if you're going to be doing them on a barbecue, be sure to also have a bit of the glaze or a bit of some marination just to be able to continue to coat your skewers. And this will, of course, always be very, very handy in making sure that they're also not too dry on the outside. And this will also enhance the fact that you're also going to keep them nice and moist right through to the middle. And as you continue to cook, very, very important to also mention one particular checkpoint for pork. Always remember, pork has to be cooked to well done. You may, of course, be able to have such instances as food poisoning, especially if you don't cook your pork completely. So very, very important to mention, always make sure that your pork is completely cooked to well done. This will, of course, limit any particular chances of you having a bit of indigestion after consuming your meal. But as we continue to wait for our skewers, maybe I'll engage you, Eunice, and ask you, maybe you can tell us something about your career. You mentioned you do data analyzing or something of the sort?
Yeah, I'm a data analyst.
Market analyst. Maybe you can give us data analyst. Maybe you can give us an idea of what that is about.
Basically, you have a website, and then there are individuals who input data on that website. So my work is to download it, and I extract it first, and then after that I come up with inferences based on the kind of data that has been set.
Okay.
So sometimes they give you guidelines on what exactly you should focus on in terms of what you're looking for.
And maybe in the aspects of data analyzing, what kind of data do you normally find yourself working with? Is it like raw figures, or is it like a lot of research that has been done? How does it work in a layman's?
No, it's usually mostly research data.
Research data?
Yeah.
And you've been doing this for how long?
Since 2017, but now this is a different company.
Okay.
So where I was working previously is different from what I'm doing right now. Yeah.
And maybe for the viewers out there who may be keen and interested in trying out to maybe venture into the same career, any pointers that you can be able to share with them? Maybe something you've learned, maybe challenges that you faced in the process of learning data analyzing?
First of all, you have to have a huge passion for mathematics.
So you have to be good with figures.
Yeah, you really
very,
have
very
to.
important.
I work a lot with figures and
Okay.
stuff.
Okay.
So you have to be very good in mathematics. Secondly, you have to have a passion for what you're doing. Because you can't have a career if you don't have a passion.
That's very, very true.
Third of all, I'll encourage everyone to actually venture. It's a new kind of market. Data science is a new kind of market, and not many people have actually gotten there. And career-wise, if you look at the number of data scientists we have in Kenya, they are very minimal. So I think for the near future, we should probably sit down and look at data science, which is the next big thing, according to my own belief.
Right, so you've all heard it from Eunice. Data analyzing is of course also a very, very beautiful career that some of you can venture into, especially if you're of course very good with mathematics, as you said.
Yeah.
Any other demands that your career may entail except for mathematics? Is there something else that you need above mathematics as a qualification?
No, you don't exactly have to be perfect. That's what I have to remind people, because I also learned along the way. Mathematics, you have to have a passion, but it doesn't mean you have to be an A mathematics kind of student.
Okay.
You just need to understand what you're doing. Basically, that's all.
And maybe something that you can also share with us on the show today. Is there any particular challenges that you may have faced in your career at the moment in terms of maybe challenges getting work, or challenges even just analyzing the data on its own?
Sometimes you find that the kind of inferences you're being asked to make, sometimes people plagiarize data, like they do repeated kind of stuff, so you can't actually get a correct inference from what you're trying to do.
So on many occasions, if the data is or the info that you get is not up to date, you may of course end up having data that is of course maybe not accurate.
Yeah, basically that's what I'm saying. And at the same time, some people will lie. When you're collecting data, people will lie. And you see when data is redundant, it doesn't become viable.
Which means, of course, at the end of your process, the results
you
that
feel like you've done nothing
okay,
at the end of it all.
Okay.
Yeah, basically. But other than that, it's actually a viable career.
And maybe also just to ask, is there any fun side to data analyzing? Because maybe we have viewers out there who think it's about sitting in a desk and just working through details and data right through. Is there a fun side to being a data analyst?
Actually, there is. There are two sides. If you're an extroverted kind of person, you get to interact with so many people at once and get the kind of information you need from them. If you're kind of an introvert, you get to sit at the desk and do the whole analysis.
Pretty much let life go
so
by
I think it accommodates every kind of personality in there. You just need to find your strongest point when it comes to it, because you can't do everything alone. There's someone who will do the research, someone who will do the collection and all that stuff.
All right.
Yeah.
Very handy tip, Eunice. Thank you very much. For some of you who've of course been listening to Eunice, maybe you pretty much have a dying passion for getting into data analyzing. I believe she's pretty much managed to sum it up. It does require a little bit of input from you as well and a bit of passion. But remember, you can also be able to be in the same career and field as Eunice by just giving it a bit of a try and also giving it a bit of some effort, yeah?
Yeah.
Perfect. Right, now Eunice, I'll bring you back to our dish for today. So as you can be able to see some beautiful color coming through, I will of course ask you to brush a little bit over the top once more. And very important to also bring you back to scratch as well with the beautiful recipe we had today. You can of course be able to also marinate your skewers in advance, and you can actually allow those to sit already assembled and ready to cook. It will of course save you a bit of time, especially if you're looking at saving a bit of time when making your next dinner meal. And something also to share, if you're looking at also different ways of pleasing guests or entertaining your guests at home, remember skewers are also a very, very handy tool, especially in portioning out meals. So if you're also looking at, maybe you're looking at trying to find a different way of serving a dish and having just enough portions to fit everybody, skewers is also a very, very good and handy way to do so. It will also, of course, save you the effort of cooking as well, as I mentioned. You can, of course, be able to cook it in very diverse ways. You can be able to cook it on a barbecue. You can do it in the oven or even on a pan. But I believe, Eunice, based on the recipe we tried today, most of the ingredients we've used are pretty much easy to find.
Readily available.
So I'm hoping you'll be able to maybe give this a try at home
Definitely.
and send us a feedback.
I must.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's a must.
And maybe also just to come back to the dish, is there something new that you may have, of course, learned with this particular dish that you haven't used before in cooking?
Actually, marinating the pork in orange juice. Because mostly when I marinate, I use lemon. Just the normal kawaida lemon juice. And at the same time, I didn't know you can actually use what you can actually
cook the marination
and
then use it as a sauce.
Use it as a sauce. So yeah, that's something new I've learned today.
Perfect. Now something I can add to what you've just said. You said you're a big fan of using lemon for your marination.
Yeah.
So I can also add to that and say any particular citrus fruit that you can find. So you can be able to use oranges, you can use lemons, you can use limes, and even on some instances you can also use grapefruit. So any particular citrus fruit that you can be able to purchase out there will of course also be a very, very good and handy tool to your marination. And two things, it actually also adds a bit of flavor, and it actually also makes it so much easier for you to actually make sure that your meat is tender because of the juices that are of course incorporated in the oranges and the lime. The little bit of acid also makes sure that you also get your meat to tenderize a little faster. But one tip I'll share with you, if you're looking at maybe meat that is a bit tough, like beef for instance, or lamb, or even goat, marinating it maybe one day before the day you'll be cooking your meat will of course make the meat much more tender. So it's also a very, very good secret to be able to tenderize your meat. Another tip I can also share, some beautiful fruits you can also use in a marination, maybe for meat. You can also try papaya. Also very, very good, especially the very ripe papaya. Also very good technique of tenderizing your meat. Yeah. Right, so as we come to the last and final part of the show, I'm just going to begin, of course, to move onto the plate the pieces of skewers that are already cooked. So I'm going to start with these 3 pieces at the very end. And as we do so, I'm going to allow for the rest of our pieces to continue to cook very, very gently and undisturbed on the pan. So very simply onto your plate, proceed to move your pork skewers. And with this, we have come to the last and final part of the show. I will thank you once again for tuning in today. And Eunice, I'll thank you once again for making time to join us on this episode. I will leave you with a small reminder. You can of course also be able to be part and parcel of our show by texting the 5-digit code on your screen. It is of course a toll-free number, which of course means you will not have any charges incurred to you. Do write to us and give us an idea of where you're from, what you do for a living, and also maybe something that you're interested in learning on our show. We'll be more than happy and get back to you. But do also remember you can be able to write back to us and give us some feedback, some queries, or even some comments by writing to us through our Facebook page, that's BrandPlus TV. And you can also be able to catch up on many of these beautiful recipes that you may have missed out on in the recent past by also liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel, that's BrandPlus TV Kenya. But for now, we'll of course leave you with a very, very humble goodbye. Do stay blessed until the next episode of Dinner Guide. Do have a lovely evening and see you soon.